Good afternoon and welcome to News24 Frontline. This is our first webinar of 2024 and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this in-depth discussion around a topic that has been causing waves not only on News24 but also countrywide in the media over the past week. My name is Adriaan Basson. I'm editor-in-chief of News24 and I'm joining you live from our office in Cape Town. The theme of our discussion today is, of course, unpacking Stellenbosch University's secret shame. Now, this time of the year, if you have worked in a newsroom as a journalist, or if you're a parent, or if you went to school or to university, you will know that this is initiation season, a practice that has been on the books outlawed for almost 3 decades. But as we have seen over the past week, is alive and kicking in the year 2024. And this, of course, doesn't only happen at the Stellenbosch University. This is but one example of this passage that, or this tradition or practice that has managed to survive even the dawn of democracy. Today, we are going to try and answer the questions. Why is this practice that some call a rite of passage still alive and seemingly thriving in secret today? Why haven't institutions like Stellenbosch University, and again, by no means this is limited to Stellenbosch, many schools at the moment have grade 8 children wearing placards around their necks, making to shave their hair, having to walk in the scorching heat and stand for hours holding umbrellas for kids 5 years older? Why have we failed as a society to eradicate these practices? And thirdly, what is trauma bonding? And is there a place for something like this in a democratic country with a Bill of Human Rights like South Africa? To help me answer these tough questions on a Thursday afternoon, I am joined by esteemed panelists today, Professor Pierre de Vos, the Claude Leon Foundation Chair of Constitutional Governance, who teaches constitutional law at the University of Cape Town. Pierre was also a resident of Wilgenhof for 2 years. I'm also joined by Dr. Nomfundo Mogapi, CEO of the Center for Mental Wellness and Leadership in Johannesburg. Nomfundo is a clinical psychologist by training, and she specializes in trauma-informed approaches. Thirdly, Marisa Honey. Marisa is a self-employed freelance translator, writer, editor, journalist, and proofreader from Stellenbosch in the Western Cape. And lastly, Laurie Gaum, an activist theologian with an artist's heart, believing in working for equity for all. Laurie is a project manager at Gender Works and a former resident of Wilgenhof Res. Welcome to all my panelists. It's great to have you here and thanks for joining us. Just for the record, and I think it's important to tell our readers this, we have invited the Stellenbosch University as well as the Wilgenhof Bond. Now, the Wilgenhof Bond is the association of alumni of former Wilgenhof residents who are still very much actively involved in the residence, and maybe one of the issues that we can talk about today. We invited both those institutions to join us to participate in this debate. After Stellenbosch University initially gave permission to Dr. Choice Makhetha, the head of student affairs, to participate, that permission was withdrawn last night. The reasons given by the university was that Dr. Makhetha is close to the current investigation into Wilgenhof, and it wasn't appropriate of her to participate in this discussion. Nico de Waal is the head of the Wilgenhof Bond. I sent him an invitation. He sent me back a message to say he was not able to participate. Quote, "As alumni of Wilgenhof, we condemn any activities or actions that are not aligned to the values of Wilgenhof residents. A key aspect of these values is ensuring equality and human dignity. We are committed as an alumni to assisting the Stellenbosch University in its investigation and will communicate when we are in a position to do so." In a letter sent out to Wilgenhof alumni yesterday that News24 got hold of, de Waal said, quote, "It is our view that engaging right now in a debate about any of the specifics of the allegations would be counterproductive and further inflame what is already an emotionally charged atmosphere." He further went on to say, and we have heard this before, that context and historical perspective are missing from current media reporting. I just wanted to put that on the record to show that we have invited Wilgenhof itself as well as the university to participate. Luckily, we do have two former Wilgenhof residents in our midst today, Laurie Gaum and Pierre de Vos. And before I start with my first question to Laurie Gaum, I want to invite you, our viewers of News24, to please send us questions on this topic. There's a Q&A box that you will see on screen. Please use that box, Q&A, click on the box, write your question with your name, please, your real name, and we will try and get in as many of the questions as possible in this rest of the 60 minutes available to us. Laurie Gaum, welcome to today's episode of Frontline. You were a resident of Wilgenhof, and you have followed the media reports on News24 and elsewhere since last week, Thursday. Were you surprised or shocked at these reports? Looks like Laurie is frozen for the moment. I hope to have him back soon. Maybe Pierre de Vos, if I can start with you. Can you tell us about your time in Wilgenhof? You've already shared some of your views and reflections on social media and on your blog last night. Tell us about your time in Wilgenhof. Why did you go there and what did you experience?
Yeah. Well, I had never been to Stellenbosch before I went there to university, so I was the idiot who looked on the map and saw that the Wilgenhof residence is next to the law faculty, and so I put that as my first option, which they gave to me. The first year, the Wilgenhof was obviously quite degrading because the whole idea of the Xhosa is here's the spirit in those days, probably to some degree still now, is that first year students had to be sort of initiated, had to be broken down, to be built up, that kind of thing, the same kind of thing that you also found in the military. And so there was initiation. You know, there's a day about 2 weeks after the start of classes where we were all blindfolded, locked in a room, played loud music, shouted at, and then you had to go into the quad. You were hoisted up and had to hold on to a rope and made to believe that you were 2 stories up, and then you had to sing a song. I chose a song by David Kramer, of all things, called Is Jy Bang vir Jou Ma, Is Jy Bang vir Jou Pa, somehow strange, I don't know why. And then, of course, you fall, but it's just a few meters. And then there's the Nachtlichter, which is, everybody has read the pieces in the newspaper. Although in those days, it was definitely not voluntary, and it was very arbitrary because you didn't really know why you were brought before this group, why you were painted in black paint, and then afterwards you had to go and try and wash it off in a cold shower. But the whole year, the first year especially, you know, the system is such that you're supposed to be scared of and fear the senior people. If you're too friendly, you get into trouble. If you're too silent, you get into trouble. If you're strange in a way that is not acceptable to somebody, you get into trouble. At the same time, the university, the residence ethos was, well, everything is acceptable. You must criticize, you must question, but nothing in the hierarchy and nothing in the course size itself. So I don't know if that is helpful to you.
Absolutely, Pierre. Pierre, what made you leave Wilgenhof? I mean, was it something specific that happened?
I wanted to leave at the end of the first year, but my parents said, no, residence is good for you, you have to stay. But then the student newspaper, Dimati, at the beginning of my second year, had a big expose about these initiation ceremonies that even then the university had said has disappeared, no longer existed. And then the Huis Committee of Wilgenhof got first-year students to go around the campus, collect all the copies of the student newspaper, and had a big bonfire in the quad, in the middle of the residence. And of course, I then the next week joined DiMarchi newspaper so that I could also expose abuses like that. And at the end of the year, I just left the university, told my parents only the next year that I had done so that they couldn't stop me. And the reason was that it was obviously not a place that I felt I belonged. It's not a place that I liked. There were nice people there in between, also really horrible people, but yeah, they were not my people. And I was much happier not to be there any longer. For others, of course, they thrive there, but definitely not everyone.
Marisa, I'm really glad to have you on the show because your voice is the one voice or one of the voices that haven't been heard yet. You were the author of that story on the cover of the Marty in 1985. Is that correct?
Yes, I was.
And please tell us. I mean, I was 5 years old, so I didn't get that copy. But please tell us about how this happened. I mean, how did the story come to be? Can you remember, how you guys got the sourcing from? I'm sure it was very hard. We're still talking apartheid days. Places like Wilgenhof were very
Mhm.
powerful. There was this culture of secrecy that's still very much around. How did you
Yeah.
manage to crack the story in 1985?
I was doing journalism honors at the time, and we were, it was quite early. Um, by around about the 12th of February, I think, we were given an assignment as part of our English part of the journalism course to write about either Doop or Yule. And I had no interest in the carnival side of things. So I decided, okay, I'll do something about initiation. And I spoke to somebody I knew who had been in Wilgenhof and asked him if he would be willing to talk with me and tell me what happened. And he was willing as long as I kept his identity a secret, because of the fear of retaliation, which I think is very real in a race like Wilgenhof. So we were sitting in the Nielsie and he was talking to me. I was making notes, and then his first year roommate came past. He was a medical student and he'd come through to Stellenbosch, and he told my informant that there were two events that he'd come through for because past students were welcome to come and watch. And the one was that, let me just see my notes here. There was going to be, sorry. Oh, the Galg, which is the one that Pierre just explained, where they get hung up and are given the impression they're very high. And then also Sloiki, which, if I remember correctly, was that the students are given the impression that they are going to be pulled for a very long distance under a cement covering through mud. And that is when I started trying to find more people to give me information. I phoned a friend. These were the days before cell phones. I phoned a friend of mine who was then a student in Wilgenhof and asked him if he could confirm that the Galg and the Sloik, that they were happening that night and the next night. And he refused to talk to me. He said that it was just too dangerous. He would get into trouble. He had to stick with not talking because there would be he would get into trouble if he spoke. He would stick with the code of Wilgenhof. Then one of my journalists, I was news editor of DiMarchi at the time, one of my journalists, Chris Barnard, took his little body off and took chances and went into Wilgenhof, filmed things, was also threatened. He was then abducted from his res and tarred and feathered and left quite a distance from his res, naked, covered in feathers and black paint, and he had to get his way back to his res. So, and that is when I decided, well, when I started writing, I approached everyone on the campus. I phoned the rector, I phoned the vice rector. Each one passed the buck along to the next one. Nobody was willing to take any responsibility for anything. The rector told me it was not within his sphere. I had to speak to the vice rector, who was in charge of, I think, also student stuff. Vice rector says, no, he can't mix in because there's a Kosse's father. the Kose's father told me that I was digging where I'm not supposed to be digging, and that everything was under control, and that what happened there was approved. When I asked him by whom, he said by everyone. So, yeah, I wrote the story. The newspaper got burned, and I got threatened a lot.
I want to get to those threats, Marisa, but just to say, for people like me, what News24 revealed last week, these pictures, I think it was about 35 pictures, were new and shocking. When you saw this, you probably didn't think, well, what's new here?
I have similar photos from the 80s that somebody gave me. Some of them were stolen at one stage. I stored the things at my then boyfriend's flat, and it got broken into, and a whole lot of my photos were taken. All his slides, he was a keen photographer, all his slides were thrown around. So yeah, there was nothing new. And I wrote already in 85 about the Nachlichter, the Ku Klux Klan type of coverings they wore, just in black. What else was there? I was quite shocked to see that nothing had changed.
So when the university says that they are shocked, Marisa, and that this, all these new things will be investigated, we're talking about what is this? This is like 9 years before democracy. We're talking almost 40 years ago. Next year.
Yeah.
When you wrote these articles, nothing is new. This was all known. The Nachlichter was known. The Sloot was known. The Golg was known. The
Room
executioner
88 or something.
Will 88 was known. But somehow this has managed to continue and survive. Laurie Gaum, can you hear us now? Are you with us? Because I really want to try and get into this concept of context. Those of you following our reporting would have seen from the start that the Wilgenhof defenders of Wilgenhof or Old Bond has said that there's context missing in what these masks mean, and the mixture of aloe crystals and linseed oil that people had to drink. So I really wanted to get someone like Laurie to explain to us the so-called context around these things. I believe Laurie has a bad signal still. So maybe Pierre de Vos, if I can quickly go back to you and specifically talk about the mask. So we've seen these pictures in the News24 photographs, or in the Marty photographs of 1985. I think some of them are also on the screen at the moment in the background. So you've got these black masks, right, that look like the kind of executioner or Ku Klux Klan type of masks. Pierre, did you ever see them, and what were they used for?
Well, it was the people who came in on an evening when people will be disciplined and taken to the will, whatever. They would wear the mask so that you would never know who these people are. And of course, they're trying to intimidate and so on. And so when you went into the room, then naked, you were, can't really remember all the detail. It only happened to me once. The other time I ran away. So you had to make some kind of obedient pledge or something. You were given some horrible things to drink and painted. But all the time, the people standing on the other side, it was dark. They kept the room dark, but there were like a few people who were the Nachlichter, and they were hiding behind the masks, obviously, and it was supposed, I guess, to be intimidating or scary. I don't know.
So we saw today in our News24 reportage by my colleague Prega Govender, we've started speaking to victims. And as you said earlier, Pierre, not all people experiencing things the same. So there were people who said, well, it was just fun. Some people were already in the army by then. And then there are people like two men we spoke to today on News24 who found this absolutely traumatizing. Pierre, were you aware at the time that this was traumatizing for some people, that this could leave scars for for a long term?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Somebody asked me that last week when I told them, oh my goodness, I was in this residence. And after thinking about it, I thought at the time, I don't think I had the vocabulary to, or system, there was no permission to even say that you can be traumatized. So for me, it was like a question about whether I'm going to play for the Springbok rugby team. This is not something that is plausible. You can't think about it that way. Personally, I hated the experience. I don't think I had permanent scars from it just because I have had other traumas. So I have quite a lot of resilience. I sort of just block it off. But other people, some people flourished in this environment, and then they go on, they become the nachligter, they become the persecutors. Others didn't flourish. And, some people also, if in a group setting like that, if somebody is identified as a weak person, a so-called weakling, there is more abuse, more intimidation, bullying that comes to them. So I can't remember now a specific person, but there were people who really didn't flourish, and probably their studies suffered as a result. My studies suffered as a result because my marks went up quite a bit after I left Wilgenhof.
Laurie Gaum, I believe that you can hear me now and that we will be able to hear you. Hi, thank you and welcome. Laurie, what did you make of what you've heard so far and of the reportage? Laurie, I think you are muted. If you can just unmute yourself. We still can't hear you. You can just try and unmute your mic. Okay. I think something is conspiring against us.
On air now, finally. Sorry for the
Yes, you are. Laurie, welcome.
Your reporting wasn't really surprising to me, of course.
Laurie, you can continue.
So, the reporting wasn't really surprising to me. Yes, of course, seeing it all together like that.
Okay, I'm afraid
distance from
Bertram, we're going to have to try and get a better line for Laurie. Dr. Nomfundo Mugabe, I wanted to bring you in at this point because we've now delved a lot into the what that has happened at Wilgenhof. We've seen the pictures on News24. We've heard from Pierre de Vos, who was a resident of this hostel, what has happened to him, and we heard from Marisa about what she uncovered already 40 years ago. I think I want to start by asking you, who's a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma. It is pretty clear to me that these harmful initiation practices have survived even the dawn of democracy. How do we make sense of this? Is there something in humanity or in humans is there something inherent that needs to degrade or belittle new people, new incomers into a society or an organization or a place?
Hi, Adriaan. Just a correction, it's Miss Mugabe, not Dr.
Miss.
I don't want to get in trouble.
No problem. That's my error.
So I think for us to understand this, we have to just understand what we learn in trauma around how our brain works. When we are talking about things that need to be rational and make sense, We are talking about things that should be stored in our cerebral cortex, which is that part of the brain. Even when we're talking about having the right policies, the right laws, we are basically saying that we need to have citizens in South Africa that can use that. However, what we're learning is that when we've had really difficult or painful experiences or traumatic experiences, and when we've either been either the victims or perpetrators, and even as children, when we have watched some of these incidences, we store them in the part of the brain that is called the amygdala, and that is the irrational part of the brain. So when people are acting from the amygdala, the way they act may not make sense to an outsider until you go back and understand their story. But I think in relation to this particular story, what we are now learning in trauma is that not only do I experience the trauma, but if I don't deal with it, I transfer it to the next generation. So we end up with behaviors that are seen as culture or as normal by the next generation, but they don't even know where these come from. And I think that's what has happened here. It is a way of being that has been transferred from one generation to the next. And the current generation just feels this compelling emotional attachment to a particular event without knowing that they've actually inherited it.
That that is fascinating. So what you are effectively saying is this secrecy and this harm that's been repeated for more than 100 years is actually trauma that keeps on being perpetuated in the name of tradition, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the history of South Africa, and again for me, Edwin, I think this conversation is so important because it gives us a doorway in addressing some of the deep-seated, unspeakable, and painful issues of our country, right? So if you look at the history of South Africa, one of the ways in which we would deal with people that have either abused power or perpetrated violence, the response would be, I think, as Marisa said it, secrecy, threatening, punishing, hiding. And if a society doesn't go back and heal that, then we take and then we transform that, and it becomes the way of responding for institutions, and even those that are in leadership. So the behaviors that we are seeing now are the behaviors of how in the past we responded to deep-seated violations. And now we are doing exactly the same thing. And we always say, as the people that work in trauma, that the danger of this is not even as much that we've gone through this trauma that we didn't deal with it, is that we become so asleep and so unaware that we are operating from a space of deep-seated trauma. And the more we are not aware, the more we think we are justified in the work that we're doing because it comes from deep seated unconscious processes, which is why, if we really want to address this issue, yes, we must do the policy and the legal stuff. However, we also need to do the formation of the traumatic history where these issues come from. And we usually ignore that in South Africa. We think it's enough to throw laws, to throw policies, but we don't question the deep-seated traumas and the emotional connection to these issues.
Absolutely. Nomfundo, we have heard, and as we've also read in Pierre's latest column, that this legacy of conscription of the military, of Afrikaner young boys of 17, 18 being sent to the military, that played a big role, could have played a big role in the establishment of some of these rites of passage, or these traumatic practices, as we've heard today. Do you think we should look at that? The fact that young men who go to Wilgenhof today clearly were not in the army, and not even for the past 30 odd years, but maybe their fathers and their grandfathers were, and that some of these traditions and expectations on masculinity, and that you should first suffer before you can succeed, has its roots in that era?
So a field of study that we do in trauma is the whole work around epigenetics, and we talk about historical trauma. And what we are learning is that if the current generation does not deal with its own trauma, then it gets transferred to the next generation. And the next generation constantly carries this burden of trauma and find themselves. And it's interesting, Marisa was like, I'm not surprised by the pictures. It's exactly what I saw in the 90s. You get caught up in this inflexible, unhealthy retelling of the story. And I think as a society, as South Africa, we really have failed our young people because our current generation, and again I talk about collective trauma from all sectors of society, black, white, brown, we have deep-seated collective trauma, but we didn't deal with it, so we have transformed it to the next, we have transferred it to the next generation. We haven't even talked sufficiently about the trauma of conscription. The way we talk about it is in a way that is judging, that is shaming, and so these young people carry that, and then they cover that by becoming even more arrogant, more violent. So I think there is definitely something in saying that if the fathers, the grandfathers didn't deal with what it has meant for them to go to conscription, and now we find in a society where you're labeled as the person that perpetrated the violence. What does that mean? They are just having all these difficult, unexplained, painful emotions. I liked what Pierre said, that the concept of trauma was very useful in giving him a language. And I think understanding this from the history of trauma begins to give us a language as to what is happening, and give them a language that will enable them to do the work without, the shaming and the attacking, which then, of course, you deal with it by covering up.
Absolutely. Pierre, these two big issues that comes up whenever one speaks of Wilgenhof, and the one is this absolute secrecy. So I was also a former journalist of Dimati, as Pierre and Marissa, and I remember my time there, which was about 20 years ago. We our big doop scandal or scandal was at Hayes Marais, which is now again in the news for unfortunately the wrong reasons. And we were kind of, at that stage, it was pretty well known what the practices were in places like Hayes Marais, etc. But I think in a way, Wilgenhof has managed to keep this veneer or this veil of secrecy around their practices, and very proudly so. That this has been going on. I want to just quickly read. I managed to. Well, people send me these things over the past few days, but there was a newspaper article from 1917. So, or this newspaper article interviewed a certain Mr. Lemmer who went to Wilgenhof in 1917, 17. And Mr. Lemmer describes what happened in 1917. The Nachtlichter is a secret gang of detectives who watched the first-year students closely. During their unscheduled nightly visits, they were dressed in black and carried smoking torches. The offender's bed was overturned. He had to listen to all his sins. He had to strip naked. He was painted. His hair was colored with chemicals. He had to drink a lovely spoon of linseed oil. Thereafter, the greenie, or the groenie, the new person, knew how to walk in tow. For outsiders, this may seem heartless, but Mr. Lemmer and his friends didn't deem it as such. So this was in 1917 already. So we're talking more than 100 years ago that we have the nudity, the linseed oil, the night lights or the nachtlichter with the masks. Then in 1973, we have we quoted a person who was a victim of the abuse at Wilgenhof today on News24. And this one student went in 1973. So this is now already more than 60 years later. And he told us, and I'm just going to quote shortly, the head of the nightlights, called the Moon, had a large glass fiber or plastic mask on, as opposed to the cloth mask the others had over their faces. Speaking in high-pitched voices, they read your crimes. A large brush dipped in linseed oil and powder paint is used by the nightlights to paint your back from neck to your bum. They would make sure they twist the brush when reaching your bum. The same brush is used to paint your genitals and the front of your body. And then in the same article today on News24, we quote a student who was in the Wilgenhof in 2012. who told us after doing all sorts of physical punishment in the quad, including cleaning the quad and walking on your knees, sometimes until they bled, first years go back to the bathroom and prepare to enter wool 88. Now, just for our viewers, wool is an Afrikaans word describing a filthy room or a filthy space. It's called a wool, H-O-O-L. And this was called wool 88, the number 88, which of course comes from the Heil Hitler sign. In this room, there are never any lights on, and so you never know what it looks like. Lights are flashed, and so you get snippets of the paint and drawings that surround you. One by one, everyone who is being punished must kneel in front of a nachlig as they force you to drink the linseed oil and aloe crystal liquid. As you are trying not to throw up, the night is over, lasting about 2 hours long, and you are then free to run back to your room. Pierre, just elaborating on some of the themes we've spoken about, I find it really phenomenal and fascinating and pretty scary that these things have managed to survive over a century. Why do you think this happened?
Well, it happens firstly because the people who go there seem and backed up by the whole system, by the old boys network, seem to want it to continue. On a more philosophical level, I think some of this in the after 94 has to do with specifically white Afrikaans people feeling that this is a kind of tradition. It's a place, Wilgenhof is therefore a place that is their place, that still has the traditions that they would have had during apartheid. So there's a kind of yearning for a kind of place of belonging that is reflecting the apartheid state of being, so to speak. But much more importantly is that the university has not, for whatever reason, they have not done what they needed to do to eradicate them. Because in the university, there are old Wilgenhoffers. Until recently, the inwonende hoof, the professor or staff member that has to oversee this, they've always been Wilgenhoffers. They must have protected the institution throughout the system. And of course, old Wilgenhoffers, in my time, one of the old Wilgenhoffers became the head of First National Bank, the other one was of the division or the whole of the other fancy bank. But in any case, so there are people, I'm not saying they were in any way involved in this, but there are people who, through money, through pressure, through the Afrikaans media, and to some extent also News24, have been trying to protect the institution of Stellenbosch, its Afrikaans language and all these things. These are powerful forces. Interestingly, I received an email this morning from a former vice-chancellor, a rector of Stellenbosch, Chris Brink, in which he set out all the things he had said about how horrible the initiation was. Nothing there about what was done to stop it. So everybody says, this is bad, we're going to stop it. Nobody actually take the steps that is necessary to stop it. Why not? Well, it will create a furor among the alumni and the traditional supporters or community groups from which Stellenbosch, who during apartheid were the main feeding ground for Stellenbosch students. So I'm quite skeptical about the commitment of the university to actually change it. I'm not saying that the university doesn't think it's horrible, that they wouldn't want to change it, but I'm not sure they're brave enough to do so because there are forces that are powerful that can hurt the university if they take the radical steps that are necessary to actually change the whole system.
Yeah. Nomfundo Mugabe, before you leave us, I do have questions from viewers for you, quite a few. So I'm going to try and combine them into one or two questions. And then, Pierre, I want to, after Nomfundo's answered, I will come back to you, to your comments. So, Nomfundo, the one question is around trauma bonding. So, Karine Smith, a user, says, I know that some kind of trauma bonding has been used at women residences as well. Obviously, not physical like at Wilgenhof, but also trauma bonding. As psychological trauma is significant, should this also be addressed? And then a second question that's related is from Ryan, who says, isn't trauma bonding just Stockholm syndrome, being the psychological condition of a victim who identifies with and empathizes with their captor or abuser and their goals? My view is that this has continued for all these years, as those that were victims would eventually become complicit years later when they become the abusers.
Yeah. So Adriaan, just before that, I wanted to really just build on what Piers was saying around why there's no shifts, why this thing continue. And for me, this is this case is very similar to a lot of other issues in our country, like GBV, because shifting these issues means that those that are already in position of power and privilege need to face themselves and deal with themselves. So it's not just about policy, it's about looking into yourself and how you also contributed. And unless we invest in doing that, we're not going to be able to create the shift. So to answer specifically on the issue, yes, trauma bonding does refer to when someone bonds with a person that have caused them deep-seated harm, and then they end up becoming like that particular person. I think that in this instance, we are with things that has been so entrenched and that have been enabled. So for people, they have been accepted and they have not been questioned. But also facing that means facing our shame, facing the fact that there's also a bit, sometimes we also do work around what people do when they are in groups, this sense of anonymity that, I'm doing it as a group, so I would do things as a group that I wouldn't do as an individual. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done, first of all, by those that used to perpetuate these things and be able to speak up about what the challenges were of that from that can really enable, because we need to open up these discussions for the people that are perpetrating this in a way that is not shaming. Because if we open up in a way that is shaming, and I know it's almost difficult in our country, right? Because when these things happen, we come with and I always say to people, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not doing the law part. I'm a psychosocial person saying how to have conversations that transform the trauma, that holds you to account, but don't come from a space of shaming, where you are able to say, what is it about me and where I come from that makes me to act like this? And Adriaan, I think in closing, because I know I have to go, is that one of the most difficult things to do for human beings in societies like South Africa that have deep-seated trauma is facing ourselves and the internal mess that we have. Unless we do that, we will keep on talking over and over about these things and not see the kinds of transformations that we need in our country.
Thank you very much, Nomfundo. I appreciate your time. We will certainly have you back on News24 to discuss this and other matters. I find it fascinating what you said, specifically around the shaming bit. Interesting enough, Pierre and Marisa, this is something that we spoke about in our own newsroom over the past few days. On the first few days of publishing these exposés, we asked for more information from our readers. We wanted more detail, more information. And then we realized there must be a hell of a lot of people who've been traumatized by what they went through in Wilgenhof, who hasn't spoken out, and even maybe have been perpetrators, have been nachtlichten themselves, and need to be helped, need to also deal with this in a way that's not shameful. And we started in a very basic way, but we started to also add references to places like the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, just if people wanted to speak to someone. So I think that's an important aspect of the story we shouldn't forget. Pierre, I want to quickly, while I have you still, I want to come to a question that's just been posted by Wallace to you, who says, Pierre, why haven't you come forward earlier or at the time when you experienced these alleged atrocities? Why now?
Well, the Marissa actually reported all of these things in my second year of university, so it is known. It's not as if it's not known. So in that sense, so that is one explanation. It is all out there. Secondly, maybe there came a point where I thought, stuff these people. I don't want anything to do with them. And I don't trust that the university is going to change anything. So we know already that it's there. And that it happened in 1985. Of course, I didn't know that it was continuing until now. But it's a good question. I would say in my first year, why didn't I speak out? Is I was scared. I was scared, both physically, scared that I would be assaulted or whatever, but also scared of being excommunicated, that I would be that I would have a social death, so to speak. So, of course, if you're first year, you don't know who you are, you want to belong. One even makes pathetic attempts to be part of the Wilgenhof culture, at least in my first year. I think I did that, yes. Which is also why I think people who say, well, as long as these practices are voluntary, it will be fine. They cannot be voluntary because that peer pressure is enormous. You have to be quite a unique person to resist it, and not to worry that maybe there's something wrong with you, or not to worry that if you do this, there will be consequences. You'll be shamed, you'll be humiliated, you might be assaulted, or whatever the case might be.
And as we have seen, Pierre, and I'll get back to that in a second, the issue of voluntary participation have now even made it into some kind of non-disclosure agreement or indemnity form, which the poor first-year students had to sign, which was also uncovered during this this raid on the residents. Marisa, tell us about what was the response to you at the time. You spoke about threats that you received, and you spoke about the horrible physical assault on your colleague at the time. What happened to you guys?
I was never. Nothing ever really happened to me. I was followed home. See, I wasn't on campus because I was a private student, and I could go home every night. But I would be followed home sometimes when I was going home at night. At one stage, I can't remember if it was the skit club or the commando offered me armed protection, because my dad was teaching at the university at the time in the art department, and they contacted him and said that I wasn't safe if I had to move around on campus at night. They are willing to offer me an armed guard. I never took them up on that, because also working at Imati, you often were there late at night. But I was threatened with rape. That was put up on the men's toilets in the library. And so at times it was a bit scary, but I don't know, I was quite used to standing up against systems, and I didn't let it get to me too much. But I quickly want to come back also to something about the whole thing about humiliation. One of the things that the first years had to do was a very explicit photo of a woman with her legs open was put up in the res, and the students had to look at it. But at one stage, they had to write an essay, and what they called a septic essay, so of a sexual nature. And if they refused to do so, and I think these are 17, 18-year-old boys, many of them, who have just come out of home, still very involved with the church, most likely. And they were threatened with that they will be kicked out of the res if they refused to write the essay. And after writing it, the theological students took them aside and criticized them for what they'd written. So it was a vicious circle. On the one hand, you have to do it because the students in charge say so, and then the students in charge, the religious ones, criticize you. So that must also have been really tough. But yes, as I said, I just pushed through and went on.
Marisa, there is I'd like to just hear your view on this. I mean, there's a constant recurring theme of sexuality, sexualization, sexual violence in these drawings that were found. They were these books. So just for the record, apparently there were hundreds of items seized by the university 2 weeks ago. a new residence head. The first time a residence head, Pierre, who was not an oud Wilgenhofer, came in December and decided to blow the whistle, so to speak, and get the university to literally knock open these doors and remove these items and paint these rooms. But hundreds of items were removed. Hopefully they're in safekeeping and are being investigated or will be investigated. Included in those photographs that we were given, so by no means have we seen everything, but included in those were very explicit drawings of male rape, for example, of female genitalia, and you've made the point, around rape threats, around pornography that every student had to write an essay about. We've also seen through all these accounts so far that nudity, there's constantly nudity. You have to strip naked from 1917. Do you have a view on Marissa on this? How this all fits into the trauma practices that Mfundo spoke about?
No, I don't know. There's this obsession of Afrikaner men with nudity. There's sort of a homoerotic element there. It's just like, you would rape someone who has molested a child because then you're going to fix him. I don't really understand it. I find it very disturbing, but I think it's also possibly comes from a very suppressive sort of background. The Afrikaans background tends to be quite conservative and suppressive, and you don't express yourself. And so all these things build up and you have these wild imaginations. And so you try to give expression to it in some way, but I don't understand it.
So I've just thought of something that might be relevant. Wilgenhof's, some of its success, if you will, has been that it is presenting itself as not a normal Afrikaans men's residence. The students are supposed to be critical. You mustn't be a parrot. You're always a little bit different from everybody else. And so in the Afrikaner nationalist sphere, with the very conservative, the kind of nudities could be explained partly as a way of saying we don't really believe in these rules. We can break the rules as long as you obey the whole system. But at the same time, also, obviously, it is a bit odd. It's quite homoerotic. I mean, in Wilgenhof, at my time at least, showers was just one communal shower. Everybody had to shower together. There was no toilet door, so you could, if you go into the toilet, there was no door. And if there was the backflaky where somebody shouted that outside, they would catch the guy, and he would come in, and he would be stripped and stood in the middle of the quad while everybody looked at this naked man. It's very homoerotic. How to explain that, I really don't know. But yeah, if it wasn't for all the abuse, it might have actually been a good place for a gay man to go to.
Pierre, I want to come back to our questions, but let's quickly talk. I saw a question here around constitutional rights, but I want to talk about this issue of consent. So there was a video that News24 published in the past few days, where Edwin Cameron, the Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, the famous judge, former Constitutional Court judge, but also former resident of Wilgenhof and quite a proud former alumni of Wilgenhof, where he addressed a group of Wilgenhof old boys or old men and made the statement, and I'm going to try and remember the quote, but it was to the extent that if you give consent, if you voluntarily accept that these things are done to you, and that you have kind of sufficient knowledge of what will be done to you, then it should be fine. Added to that, Pierre, the indemnity form that we published, that students had to literally sign that they agreed that this private company, coincidentally owned by an old man of Wilgenhof, might injure you. I think they mentioned minor injuries, major injuries, or even death, and that you will be exposed to a lot of nudity. just from a pure legal perspective, black and white, can you ever give someone permission to physically abuse, harm, injure, or kill you?
It probably not kill. No, not kill, because that will be unlawful. It will be against the bony mores of society. Harm, yes. So if you are in a consensual sadomasochistic relationship, obviously but in the context of Wilgenhof, the problem is that consent cannot possibly be informed and voluntary, because it is in a system, a hierarchical system, peer pressure. That consent, some people might give it voluntary, but I would think most people will just do it because that is what you're supposed to do. So the idea of consent, no. The idea of consenting to being killed, no, that is not possible. You should be prosecuted for murder if somebody kills you, even if you had consented. So those are problematic arguments. But of course, it's not only, there's the laws of the land, but then there are the rules of the university. These practices, I haven't studied the rules of Stellenbosch University, but clear, they must surely be in conflict with the rules of conduct of that Stellenbosch students are bound by. I wonder why the people in the residence, the primarius, the head boy, the house committees currently in charge, why they have not been suspended from their positions. Why are they the previous head in Wilgenhof, is that person going to be facing disciplinary action? Because these are the kind of things, if no action is taken, that sends the signal that in the end, nothing will really happen.
Yeah. I must say, this is one of the story, as serious as it is, Pierre, it also writes its own jokes. One of the former Wilgenhof is a professor in ethics, who we will still speak to. Pierre, a few questions from readers. If we can give quick answers, we're running out of time. Is this kind of initiation practice an Afrikaans issue or a masculinity issue?
I think it's both. There's a specific historical Afrikaans tradition of the initiation, and maybe linked to the military service, but other things as well. Obviously, it's also a masculinity issue, toxic masculinity, yes. So I would say definitely both.
There's a question here from Karine. Is any suspicion of similar initiation events at other residences at Koffsies or Pretoria? I cannot answer that question. I have heard many stories, Karine, and News24 will continue to investigate this, and hopefully there will be people who blow the whistle on this. Stories about initiation at other residences are plentiful if you Google them, and schools. Then there's a question about, will famous Omanne from Wilgenhof be questioned? There's a name of a rugby player. I just want to verify that indeed he was there. They are still very active about the new leadership in the house. Boys, so proud to continue being part of the reputation. Zanel, I don't know. I know that the Wilgenhof bond is very strong. It is financially supported by very rich South African businessmen in society. Some of them Pierre has referenced. So I guess there may be some kind of large track around the case by Wilgenhof. If they were here, we could have asked them, but they chose not to. And then Nasima Pierre asked, shouldn't your constitutional right to human dignity be more powerful than initiation or residence?
Yeah. Yes, of course. So this is another problem with the consent issue, because if you say you're in a university based on the values of dignity, equality, freedom, these practices are dehumanizing. They treat first-year students especially as not being fully human. So it is preposterous to think that any rules, any practices like that could pass constitutional muster, whether the consent was given or not. And that's over and above whether it is in conflict with legislation or the criminal law or whatever the case might be.
Marisa and Pierre, I want us to end on a solutions note. I want us to end on something, at least, whether Pierre thinks it's going to happen or not, which he clearly doesn't think. Let's just think about solutions. So there's questions around what can we do to support LGBTQ plus alumni who's starting to maybe process their experiences. It's a question about how can we support the students currently in Wilgenhof. And Pierre, you've written or you've told a journalist that you think it should be turned into a women's residence. So Marissa, if I can come to you first and then end with you, Pierre, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 things that you think the university or the community at large should be doing immediately.
Sure. I would say that one has to go back to the rules of the university. And that's one of the issues I took up when I phoned the rector and the vice rector and the COSAS founder that day. I kept on quoting from the university rules. The university rules prohibit DUP, and they prohibit any action that humiliates people. Even pulling a pillowcase over someone's head is against the rules. So I think one needs this complete transparency, and that the university must say, we have a rule that says DUP is against the rules, and it stops now. But I can't see how that can ever happen. Oh yeah, I'm going to struggle to give you any answers here.
Pierre.
Yes. So you mentioned something at the end there, which is also important, which I haven't spoken to, and that is, although this is a kind of homoerotic environment, it is also an environment for some LGBTQ people that is particularly difficult and particularly harmful or hurtful. Solutions, I think there needs to be action taken to show that anybody who's going to get involved in any of this or look away, that they will be expelled from the university at the very least. Then one should think of acts that is going to break the kind of idea that COSASA has this specific geest, that they have this specific, kind of ethos or whatever. That needs to be eradicated. That's very difficult to do, which is why I said maybe just close the Wilgenhof down or turn it into a women's residence, because how do you change this thing that is permeating the whole? There's a history of 120 years. So if you don't firmly respond and take action against those who let this happen, either by participating or by turning a blind eye, and if you don't enforce that, you're never going to change it. But even then, there might be people who want to continue doing this. So then you have to have avenues for people who are subjected to this, to feel that they trust the avenues to come and report this so that it can be exposed, because that is how we have now seen that something is being reported, and that might help make a difference.
Well, we will certainly be closely tracking this investigation by the university. The names of the panelists have not yet been announced, but we know that it will be a senior advocate from the Cape Bar, a university expert from another university, as well as one of the deputy registrars of Stellenbosch University. For now, the rooms have been painted white, not black, as the famous song goes. They're white. People now live in them. And the university says no initiation will be tolerated. Pierre, Marissa, we've heard this before, but let's see if we can hold them to account this time. Pierre de Vos and Marissa Honey, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you to the viewers, our readers out there, for your contributions, for your questions. Please continue to follow this discussion and story and debate on News24. Send us your contributions on the platforms available. Thank you. Until next time, goodbye.